Hi, welcome to Safe Spaces in the Digital Realm, with a focus on LGBT youth. My name is Dr. Shelley Craig. I'm a professor of social work at the Factor Inwantage Faculty of Social Work at the University of Toronto, and I'm really excited to be here and to be part of this global challenge. I know you all are going to do amazing things. So I'm going to share my screen today, and I'm going to talk to you a little bit about some of the research that I've conducted recently on the role of technology in the lives of LGBTQ youth, and really with specific implications on their mental health. So again, the name of the title, the name of this talk is Safe Spaces in the Digital Realm, Supporting the Mental Health of Sexual and Gender Diverse Youth. So we're not going to spend tons of time today on this. I have lots more that I can help with if you're interested. But I'm going to briefly describe this project called Project Queery. I'm going to talk a little bit about what we found are related to the risks of poor mental health with LGBT youth populations. I'm going to talk a little bit about the potential of technology and affirming approaches from their point of view. And we're going to learn a little bit from a couple of the Queery participants. So Project Queery, which is the study that we're talking about today, was a mixed methods online study that was digital only, and we conducted this online study across the US and Canada. So specifically, we're looking at LGBT youth mental health and online activities, and our sample size was a little over 6,000, so a decent sample size. We looked at every state and every province in the US and Canada. So we had a broad swath of participants. In terms of recruitment, it was digital only, online outreach, and again, we used all kinds of existing or emerging LGBTQ groups. This study, it was a couple of years ago, so Tumblr was still in force. I know that's something that is not as utilized in the same way. We also worked with community partners. We had a YouTube commercial, interactive poster. Specifically, we recruited youth and young adults between 14 and 29 that identified as sexual or gender minority youth broadly, so non-cisgender, non-heterosexual in some way, and resided in the US and Canada. We looked at a few key mental health measures that really had not been looked at with this population. So we wanted to understand what LGBT youth were reporting as adverse childhood experiences, which I'll talk about. We talked about internalized stigma or transphobia, so the discrimination that one directs inward, and because of being sexual or gender minority, having a sexual or gender minority identity. We looked at microaggressions, specifically environmental and interpersonal. I'll talk about that. And we also looked at social support, peer and family, as well as school belonging, because that is found to be important to the development of youth. We also looked at a couple of different measures. We looked at the Beck's Depression Inventory, and then we looked at suicidality with regard to 6 months, which is suicidal ideation, and whether or not they had ever tried to commit suicide. We also looked at a few measures of social media use. One example of social media well-being was a scale that we constructed, and we tried to identify, we had them identify their 5 favorite sites, again, a couple of years ago, but we then identified the types of sites and why they use the favorite sites. And so we had quite an extensive list, and this came from our work with youth advisory boards. And then we had a qualitative question about how they felt strong or dealt with stress in their life. This is who we had participate. So average age, a little under 18, so fairly young, and about three quarters from the US and about a quarter from Canada. And they were fairly evenly split between large urban areas, towns, and then a smaller amount in rural, which is expected. In terms of gender identity, the participants, almost half identified as non-binary, and a number identified as trans or gender fluid, queer, man or woman. And the most frequent gender identities that we found were gender fluid and queer, for example, and lots of participants also identified as trans. With regard to sexual orientation, a large number of our participants identified in some ways under the pan umbrella, so pansexual, panromantic, as well as a number of more fluid labels, so queer, bi underneath the bi umbrella, again, bisexual, biromantic, for example, or asexual. So 15% of participants identified as asexual with a whole range. And the sexual and gender identities were not mutually exclusive, so we wanted to make sure that they could participate and reflect themselves in all of the different categories that made sense to them. What did we find in terms of threats to well-being and mental health? So we found minority stressors, environmental microaggressions, which I'll talk about, internalized self-stigma, and adverse childhood events. But the way that we frame this study and the way that we frame the experiences or understanding the experiences of LGBT youth is really from the minority stress framework. So this suggests that there are disproportionate health risks and inequalities and health inequities that are experienced by transgender youth and adults, as well as sexual minority youth and adults, that are related to exposure to identity-based stigma, oppression, and victimization. So this is sort of understanding that it is stressful to be a young person, and it is even more stressful to be a member of the LGBT community because of the specific stressors that LGBT youth experience. So exposure to identity-based stressors is associated with elevated mental health risk, including increased suicidality and depression. We also looked at the daily stressors of LGBT youth or sexual and gender minority youth. And what we found is that young people, over half, often became upset when things happened unexpectedly. 66% felt like they were unable to control their lives. 83% felt stressed on a daily basis. And again, these are very or fairly likely to occur. Many felt like they were getting angry, out of control, that difficulties were piling up. And again, we understand from our previous research that a lot of these daily stressors are related also to the experience of being a marginalized person in today's society. Then we also found the interpersonal risk factors. So we looked at microaggressions. So microaggressions are the idea of these daily chronic attacks that one feels to their emotional and sometimes physical, but mostly emotional well-being. So these daily threats. So this could be something like folks assuming someone like a parent or teacher assuming that you're straight when you're not, or asking about your boyfriend if you have a girlfriend, for example. It could be another interpersonal risk factor is internalized self-stigma. So we know that there's higher rates, an example with this population, higher rates of internalized transphobia or homophobia are associated with suicide attempts and suicidal ideation. And what that means is if you dislike yourself or you are unable to accept yourself for being LGBT, that can mean that you have a higher likelihood of feeling suicidal. And adverse childhood events, which I'll talk a little bit about. Adverse childhood experiences or events and are essentially on a list of adverse childhood events. We look at sort of the original 10 for the purpose of this study. And these are things that happen to you, physical, emotional abuse, or things that happen within your family as a type of what we'll call family dysfunction. So this could be living in a household where a parent has a substance use or addiction issue or mental illness issue or has gone to prison or seeing domestic violence, for example. So what we found in our study is significantly high rates of ACEs, adverse childhood events. So these are events that happen under the age of 18 among LGBT youth. We know that adverse childhood events have significant impact on long-term mental health of all populations. So we were disheartened, but somehow not surprised that the rates were very high with LGBT youth. So high rates of emotional abuse and emotional neglect, physical neglect, living in a household where there's significant mental illness, that takes a toll on your own mental health. We also noted that youth, particularly we're specifically thinking of sexual and gender minority youth, but also trans youth had high rates of trauma. Typically we think of 4+ ACEs, so having more than 4 ACEs is associated with poor mental and physical health. And the average was almost 4 for this population, so significantly high. So these are very troubling statistics, and this is part of the reason we do the research is we want to understand what the lived experience is, including the challenges and the stressors and the risks for LGBT youth. And then we want to understand, okay, what can we do and how can we kind of know what's happening and kind of share this information with other people and help? How can we do this both as social workers, as adults, as peers, as friends, whatever that looks like? So what we do know is that peer support, so support from one adolescent to another, has a significant impact on depression, anxiety, and suicidality. So it's really important to feel that you belong and that you're connected. We also know that parental support reduces depression in LGBT youth and also supports a higher or better quality of life. And we also know that school belonging, so being accepted, respected, and included by others in school has positive impacts on mental health and overall positive development. We do know that self-acceptance and so accepting yourself as an LGBT person, for example, and is related to reduced depression and better coping, healthier coping mechanisms. And self-efficacy, which is the optimistic self-belief that allows you to cope with a variety of difficult demands in life, is related to reduced risky health behavior and mental health issues. We also know that this idea of hope is really, really important, and we think about this a lot and try to work with to understand how we can support this in LGBT youth. Hope is the idea of it's a feeling of expectation and desire for a particular thing to happen, and it is related to reduced suicidality, depression, sexual risk, and increased self-efficacy. So all of these stressors and all of these challenges have a significant impact on the mental health of youth and sexual and gender minority youth and young adults. So what did we find? We found that 80%, so 8 out of 10, of LGBT youth in our study, which was of all youth, report moderate depression. So most of these young people are not necessarily in care or getting support. And so we want to take that into consideration. The daily stresses of living as an LGBT young person can take a toll on your mental health. We recognize that, and that's not your fault. That is related to the society in which we live in, and that we have to collectively work together to change. But really understand that for the LGBT youth that are in your life, it is not their fault. And what also has a particular impact are this idea of these early traumatic childhood events, feeling of internalized transphobia or homophobia, not accepting yourself as an LGBT person, which is difficult because of the interpersonal microaggressions. So what you hear from maybe another person at school or what you see in the environment, maybe it's a negative message about trans folks and you identify in the trans community, that has an impact on your mental health. We also found in terms of suicidality that about half had one lifetime suicide attempt, and over 3/4 had considered suicide within the past 6 months. So we want to take into consideration the high rates of suicide attempts and ideation within this population when we're thinking about support. We do want to think, I just want to mention one thing because it relates to technology use, this idea of the interpersonal theory of suicide. So what we know that are significant predictors of suicidal ideation or the desire or the contemplation of suicide are the perceived burdensomeness. So this idea that I'm causing too much trouble for my family, for my community, that I'm more trouble than I'm worth, for example. whether or not I have the capability, and even more, most importantly, is this thwarted sense of belonging. So feeling like you don't belong anywhere also is linked to increased suicidality. So what did we find? So these, again, are particularly troubling statistics. These are difficult patterns, even in today's environment where we do see better representation of LGBT youth in the media and as role models. So we wanted to understand just a little bit about the role of technology and social media. So we know from our previous work that online, even for youth in urban areas that are very open and accepting, being online is still much safer and better for their mental health in many ways than being offline. So we have to take that into consideration. There are a lot of stresses. There's a lot of things that are negative that happen online, but we need to recognize that it's still a safe place for LGBT youth. Most youth have access to a smartphone, and most report being online constantly now. What we found in our study is most spent over 4 hours online daily, and they were most active on YouTube, Facebook. Again, this was a couple of years ago. We definitely would see a switch in this over the last 2 to 3 years between Facebook and Tumblr, as well as Snapchat, of course. Instagram certainly has increased. And what we found is the social media use specifically really supported, particularly for younger youth. So there's some differences by age here, but particularly for youth between 14 and 18, being online really was a big contributor to their emotional support and overall development. So also provided for all the different groups as a source of general information and education, as well as a specific amount of place for LGBTQ information, learning about others' identities, how folks talked about themselves, how they were able to navigate the world, seeing their transition stories online. All of that was very beneficial to the well-being of the LGBT participants in our study. There's also the role of entertainment, of course, or giving space, and this was discussed as watching something in hopefully in many ways with some LGBT positive representation, but that was a way to give space to the stressors that were happening to them in their daily lives and how it impacted their mental health. Sometimes they just took, there's a bit of a break, and I think in many ways we all do that in thinking about entertainment. What we found in terms of some specific quotes is that involvement with technology was a really, really important part of our participants' lives across all the age groups. So for this particular participant who identified as a trans man, that they stated that without the internet, they are certain that they would not be alive, that their friends online had kept them calm and talked them out of suicide when there was no one else. This being online is a place to be affirmed as one's authentic self. Experiencing a sense of belonging. Remember, this is really important when we think about this issue of mental health and when we think about suicidality in particular for populations. So it's a safe space, and this is a place where young people are creating and have for a number of years now created communities that welcome others and support others. So even when there are challenges online or offline, these are places that are safe and provide a buffer for their mental health. And also a place to cultivate hope. You can see other people who are like you, who have been successful and made it through their struggles of being an LGBT young person. And this idea of giving back. So online, as folks receive and continue to receive support, they often move into the place of giving support and guidance to others. So almost into a mentoring role. That's also quite important when we think about mental health. So in terms of our summary, I want to just note that technology is absolutely a bridge to better mental health for sexual and gender minority youth. You may know this as your own experience or as experience of a friend, but now we know this in a very large scale study, and it's very unequivocal. So it has really, being online and technology has revolutionized the experience of navigating an LGBT identity. We are able to come out online, try that out, get some acceptance and some support. And a lot of folks often do that before they go and tell somebody offline about their LGBT identity. There's more spaces online that are more socially just, where you can experience and and explore your gender diversity, benefit from mutual aid, find community and belonging, and be affirmed and not rejected. And these sources do potentially mitigate all of those stressors and the rejection experienced offline on a daily basis in those constant microaggressions that LGBT youth experience. So what do we need to remember? LGBT youth are stressed. They may be traumatized from their adverse childhood events. All of this has a significant impact on mental health. So we need to help now, and we need to think about how can we help each other as peers, maybe as professionals, as folks that are working in the educational sector. How can we work together to reduce the high rates of poor mental health with LGBT youth? So what we are, in terms of hope, we find that technology is the way, or a key way, to support hope. So even without the presence of supportive adults online, offline, LGBT youth are creating these worlds of mutual aid and safety, and they're creating this online and producing it, and that can create opportunities for support and belonging and enhance their coping and mental health. Remember that it is really, right? You can't learn if you're that stressed, and LGBT youth are very stressed. So we're really trying to continue to understand how this works now within the context of school, being delivered in many cases online within the COVID pandemic. So this is sort of something that we're learning and we're working on as well. But in terms of some key takeaways on how to support LGBT youth mental health, recognize they're under a lot of stress, and for most or many of them, it is safer online. So just recognize that as you are paying attention to the experiences that they're having. Recognize a range of identities. I shared many sexual orientations and gender identities that LGBT youth feel reflect their experiences. So we need to be open to those. We need to learn and support. We really want to, there are often these sort of dominant narratives that talk about technology is only cyberbullying and only relates to poor mental health. And that certainly is the reality. We have to support youth to make their own choices to support their own mental health. Sometimes that is signing off. But we want to make sure that it is a discussion that takes both the resilience factors, resilience supporting factors, as well as the risks into consideration. And really, as we're thinking about our education and our practice, try to figure out what online sources of support we can use, and ask the young queer people in your life, ask them, what do they use, what do they recommend, and really try to understand that. Definitely consider, with all of these creative brains, try to consider developing affirmative interventions or online services that may be particularly useful to support mental health. I have one I'm working on called Affirm, and that's being delivered online, and that's really shown some great outcomes in terms of reduced depression. So really thinking about how can we use technology to support and improve the mental health of LGBT youth, while working, of course, through all the research with LGBT youth. And most of all, it's really important to learn and listen from the queer youth in your lives. There is so much, and there's so much wisdom and so much resiliency that young people are experiencing, and it's great to just be able to learn and support, and sometimes think about how can I take what I'm learning and really support all of the young people in my lives, even the ones that are not necessarily aware of their sexual orientation or gender identity yet. How can I be as affirming in a proactive way as possible? So thanks so much, and here's a reference list. This is my email if you have any questions, but thanks so much, and I hope I'm super excited to see what happens with the Global Challenge, but definitely take into consideration and remember all of the queer youth that are part of the different sociocultural contexts that you're in. Thanks.